32 ticks following, so they are swallowing. Monkey is swallowing. Snake self swallowing. Next, a swallow two will fly and come and swallow. You're ever swallow in a hollow gallow, making a whole lot of halabaloo. Jale kalu, we know say you chop the money some, so give me the loot. Do you really want a revolution or just your turn?
Hello, Petina. How are you?
Hi, Tony. How are you?
It's been a while. I'm good. 4 or 5 years now.
Yes, 5 years in which you have managed to look very presidential, I have to say. You know, with the beards and the wise African politician look. Very impressive.
Nice to have you on this one. I've been reading your new book, and we're going to talk about it today. I'm going to start with a quick one, right? Where did the idea for the story come from? Did Mr. Conrad have anything to do with this?
It's actually extraordinary, Tony. Almost everybody asks me about Conrad. But Conrad came in right at the end when I was looking for a title. But he certainly wasn't there at the beginning. I had this idea for this book possibly from the time I was 16, because that's when I discovered the story of the companions. I knew the story of David Livingstone from the time I was maybe 10 or 11, because I'd read about him in the Queen Victoria Memorial Library. But it's only when I went to secondary school and we're now doing history from an African perspective that I learned about Chuma and Susi carrying his dead body. And I was really perplexed and just puzzled by the whole thing, because I was asking myself, why do it? Why carry a dead body for 9 months when the person could easily have been buried in Africa? So that's really where the idea came from, my history lessons, I guess, when I was about 16 or so.
Reading it, what I saw was a kind of reversal of roles from Heart of Darkness, Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And then, so in looking at it, so you see a place that was a place of darkness and absence, suddenly becomes alive with people. And those people who were completely ignored in the first narrative become central to this narrative. So did you have that at the back of your mind, some kind of literary deconstruction of colonial narratives? Is that something that you had also going with you?
I would say that the intention wasn't to excavate these lives in an intentional way. The intention was always to write a gripping adventure story. But the more I wrote, the more I researched, because I spent 20 years writing this book. And in fact, it was supposed to be my first book. But I didn't trust myself as a writer. I didn't trust that I had enough knowledge about life in Africa in 1873, Victorian expeditions in Africa and so on. So I needed time to research. But the more I thought about it, the more I wrote, the more I realized that it's actually part of my own continuing project as a writer, which is to decolonize the narrative of my country and, by extension, my continent.
Thank you. So like I said before, it's interesting how political a book do you think you've written, because you did not just bring in the so-called or the African who has been written out of the colonial narrative. You brought him back to the center, and then you went and then did a double whammy, and then you also brought in a woman to the center as the first narrator. So did you have that political mindset as you're writing this, or it just happened?
Tony, I've struggled with this question for the last 10 years of my career, since my very first book came out. Am I a political writer? I don't think I've set out to be a political writer. It's just that I've written stories that are set within a particular political context. And in the same way, I wouldn't say that Out of Darkness is a political book, but it certainly invites a political reading, right? It invites a political reading from the perspective of feminism, from the perspective of decolonization, but yes, I would say that to the extent that the decolonization debate is a political conversation, then yes, I would say it's a political novel in that context. But what it is at its heart, and what all my books are at their heart, is stories of very small lives. I'm interested in small lives. I'm not interested necessarily in the great men. Of course, we feel the effects of decisions of great men in the lives of very small people. But I'm actually much more interested in those small lives, how people fall in love, how people bury each other, how people make do with very little, how people see the great men. So that's why for me, it was very important to start off the book with a dead Livingstone. He's the great man of this book, isn't he? But he's dead when the book starts. And then we immerse ourselves in the very small lives of the companions of the people around him.
That came out very well. I saw that. There is a certain fly on the wall quality to your writing, like you're always eavesdropping, listening into what people are saying, picking out, bits and pieces. I saw that in Elegy for Easterly, and it's also here, where you're like a sponge. You're soaking up all the emotions, all the actions, all the unspoken, if you like, words. Do you agree with that assessment of your writing personality?
I agree heartily with that assessment because I am a sponge. I am an inveterate eavesdropper. Some of my favorite stories came from overhearing conversations or just glancing newspaper headlines, and then you just see the headline without seeing the story, like man dances self to death. I mean, come on. I mean, how can you not write a story about a man who dances himself to death? And what I loved about the eavesdropping here is that I was eavesdropping on historical sources, if you like. I was eavesdropping on Livingstone, gossiping about his companions in his letters. I spent lots of time with Livingstone's letters in the National Library of Scotland. I spent a lot of money buying first editions of his journals, because I wanted to read the versions that people were reading in Victorian England when he was writing about his journeys. And the lovely thing about Livingstone, and that made him such a joyful person to write about, even if I disagreed with many of his attitudes, is that he was a generous writer. I mean, he should have been a novelist, really. I mean, he was a perfect observer. He was interested in everything. And they would travel, right? And then they would be stuck for like 2 or 3 weeks. And Livingstone would do nothing but write as long as he had ink and paper. And even when he didn't have ink and paper, he would make ink out of berries and write over old newspapers. That's how much of a writer he was. So he had such a lot to say about his companions, Halima's furious gossip. He talks about one woman called Ntawoeka who is impossibly pretty and says that, she has to be married off because she's going to cause trouble among the men and the women. He has all these lovely anecdotes. Chuma and Susi ran away today, but they came back. Halima quarreled with Ntawoeka today, but she's a good soul. Chirango stole some beads today and I had him beaten up, So it was these little bits of gossip, eavesdropping on Livingstone, as it were, that allowed me to, in sponge fashion, as you say so nicely, to absorb everything and sort of like reproduce it as my own work.
I met lots of fictional characters, but I have never met a character as repulsive and fascinating as Jacob Wainwright. He's such a self-righteous, annoying fellow, but you just want to know what he has to say. So I don't think, was there a Jacob Wainwright? Really, was there a character like that with Livingstone, number one? And number two, did you base this character you've drawn on somebody you know or people you know?
Right. So again, just to set it up for viewers, so Halima is the narrator of the first part of the novel. So we enter the world of Livingstone's journey, last journey, through the eyes of Halima. Right. So she's the one who explains to us what camp life is like. We meet the characters through her perspective. But then the second part of the journey, when they're actually now starting the journey, is narrated by Jacob Wainwright. And there was a very important practical reason I chose to use Wainwright to narrate the second part. As I said before, Wainwright is the man who was the scribe of the party. He could read and write, and he was interested in basically his passion was to save Africa for Christ, right? Because he had been a rescued slave. He was a man from Yao, in what is now Yao land in Malawi. He had been sold into slavery as a young boy, rescued by the British Navy on the Indian Ocean on the way to Zanzibar to be sold, and taken to India, to a school called the Nasik School, where freed slaves were taken to be educated, taught English, taught European dress, Christianized, and so on. So you can imagine, Tony, you're an 8-year-old boy, 7 years old, right? You are rescued by these white people, and they take you to India, and they give you Jesus, right? You discover that you've been saved, right? They teach you a language, right? They give you an education. They give you a purpose, right? So all that Jacob wants to do is to go back home and save his people for Christ. Salvation is what drives him. So yes, he's extremely annoying because he is righteous. Righteous people are annoying, right? He's extremely righteous.
Self-righteous. No, he's not righteous. He's self-righteous.
He's self-righteous, exactly.
That's the problem. Yeah.
He's self-righteous, and he has you know, those people who are called legends in their own minds. He's one of those. He's a legend in his own mind.
Superior ends, you know? Yeah.
And there's a passage I would love to read at some point where he says that, you know, it's such is the power of my arguments that whenever I was at school and I'd approach a crowd of boys, they would all disappear because so forceful are my arguments. But of course, they're all disappearing because he's so bloody annoying, right? I love to write. I don't know about you, Tony, but I like to write unlikable characters because I think even the most unlikable characters can create a bond with the reader, especially if you give them, you know, that thing in theater. Because I'm now a playwright, so I'm now talking theater language, darling. You know, I'm talking about motors. You know, if you give them a motor, what is their motivation? What is it that they want? What is their yearning? What is their need? So for Jacob, his need was always very clear to me, and it's a need that explains everything about his personality. He really feels inferior, and he feels that what saved him and what made him who he is the blood of Jesus, right? So I think that anyone who has had that experience of salvation can actually relate to Jacob Wainwright, even though they can't necessarily relate to his priggishness or his self-righteousness, you know?
Okay, so I'm gonna ask you to read something for us.
Yes.
I have like a million questions, but let's fill the book, and then we'll come back to more questions. But I disagree with you. I think that Jacob Wainwright is a very annoying guy.
No, so I will defend Jacob Wainwright to the death, because you know what? It's so interesting, Tony, because we had this multiple conversations with my different editors around the world. Why is he so annoying? And I said, well, he's a product of his environment. And, you know, it's actually, I've read a couple of reviews which sort of made me a little bit sad, but, you know, I still insist on the decision. They say that the book kind of loses its flavor when Halima stops speaking, when Jacob Wainwright takes over. But it absolutely had to be that way, Tony, because if Halima had continued narrating, we would never have known where in Africa we were. She's uneducated.
We'll come back to that after you read, you know?
Okay. Okay, what do you want me to read?
So, can you read about, if you don't mind, I like the part, I think that was page 79, where she talks about how men think they are in charge, but women actually, you know, make the decisions. You remember that part?
Ah, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So let me read from the top of the page, okay? By the time I reached the women, the news that the Bwana was to be buried that day had spread throughout the camp. As I joined them, Ntaweka and Misozi were already discussing the news with the others. I have already talked to Amoda, I said. I have told him that they cannot bury him here. And you, Misozi, you must talk to Susi. You tackle Mabruk in Taweka, and Laede will talk to Munyasere. Khadija and Binti Sumari will talk to their men too. If we get the caravan leaders to agree, then the other men will follow. Misozi, as always, was slow to catch on, but Ntaweka, Lady, and I looked at each other in perfect understanding. This is how we normally manage things when we wanted something. We talked it over amongst ourselves first, then with our men separately, until they believed that our thinking was their own.
Thank you. So now you talked about people saying that the novel lost steam kind of when you move from Halima to Jacob, right?
Yes.
For me, it wasn't about losing steam. It was about being upset. Like, why are you denying me the company of this,
Of Halima.
crazy woman? But you know, I also think you were. So now I hear you trying to say you are sympathetic towards Jacob, but in a way, I thought you were comparing in order to show how men can be priggish and self-righteous and whatever, while women can be a bit more real. Because Halima is natural; she says what she wants to say. There's no. I mean, I was following Jacob, but after what happens between him and Ntweka, I'm like, this guy is just crazy. I mean, he's trying to justify the craziest thing he's done, and I don't even see where it
Which
comes
we can't tell readers about because we don't want to spoil it for them.
Yes. So I'm like, this is not the way a normal person behaves. He's just crazy, but so self-righteous, so self, But anyway, I have more questions for you, right? The women were always choosing the men, right? But I know.
But women do that. Women always choose men. Men think they choose women. You are chosen. You are marked out. You are.
Like, it was as if, but once they chose the men, they became subservient in a way. So which was kind of funny. The power dynamic was funny to me. So he buys Halima, asks her to choose. She chooses Amoda, but then Amoda starts beating her. So even with Chirango and Kinaki. So why does it happen? Why is it that the power seems to dissipate once the choice is made?
You see, I actually think, we can talk forever about the battle of the sexes, but I think that women are tougher than men for many reasons. And one of the ways in which women are tougher is the sublimation of the ego, right? Women don't have to show that they're in charge in the way that men do. Women exercise power quietly. That for women, it's not about the ego. So a woman is perfectly willing to stand behind a man and exercise power through that way. Whereas a man would never, ever be willing to exercise power through a woman. You see, and that's the difference. And I was saying that I don't know about your parents' marriage or the way you grew up, but many of my friends, and I can certainly speak to that in my own family, the father is the one who's blustering, I'm the head of the house and so on, but it's the mother who makes the decisions, quietly through persuasion. Iron fist in a velvet glove. That's the power of women, and I love it. And so Halima and Jacob, it's not just the power thing. It's more that I wanted to contrast. Halima is a slave, or she believes she's a slave. She believes that David Livingstone bought her, right? He actually bought her for his, because one of his men took a fancy to her. So he bought her because he wanted her to be part of the expedition, right? But in her mind, she belongs to the Bwana. So as soon as he's dead, she's thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to be inherited by his children, right? So that's her narrow world. That's her worldview. But at the same time, she's the most liberated person in the book. She speaks freely to David Livingstone. She has great fun with him. Why are you looking for the beginning of a river? Are you crazy? Go home to your children. So she speaks very freely to him. Whereas Jacob Wainwright, who is a free man who was once a slave, he is the most constricted, the most unfree person in the whole book. because he has chosen to enslave himself to something that he can never be a European, he can never be a white man, but he is trying very hard to ape and approximate what it is to be white, because for him that's what it means to be civilized. So he has to come to an understanding that he's in chains, while Halima, who thinks she's in chains, has to come to an understanding that she's free.
Wow. That's cool. That's cool. That's cool. So, I think there's, in the whole book, like what you just did now, there's always there are double layers of meaning, and also double layers of communication, if you will. So, and one of the most glaring for me is the one about light. So you keep on using light, but you're using it in such a subversive, if you will, way. So there's light. Davidson has come to Africa to bring us light. Jacob is trying to take light back to the Yao people. So what does light mean for you in regard to this book?
Now that's where Joseph Conrad comes in. That's where Out of Darkness is a response to Heart of Darkness. And that's where there was a conscious decision to write back in that sense, because the book is actually supposed to be called The Last Journey of Dr. Livingstone, and then in brackets, From the Interior to the Coast of Africa. But everybody hated that title. Why? Because the journey starts halfway. And everybody was saying, okay, people are going to be flipping this book, waiting for the journey to start. And I said, yeah, but the journey is just a trigger, right? This is a story about the companions, not just about the journey. The journey is what triggers many of the events that happen to them. And the journey is why we're interested in them. But it's not about the journey, it's about the companions. So we had this endless back and forth with my editors, until I realized actually they are right. Because if I put journey in the title, people will be waiting, so when is this journey going to start? So I thought, let me find a title that speaks to what I think they did, which is an enormous act of sacrifice in which 10 people died, really historically, 10 people died on the way to bring David Livingstone home. And they had to go through a circuitous route to avoid slave trading parties, because so the more direct route would have put them in the path of slave trading parties. So it was a very difficult journey. They fell ill. It took 9 months. So I thought, let me find a title that speaks to the enormity of the undertaking. Right. And then, so I was, I read a lot of poetry. I was reading The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot, and then something popped out, The Heart of Light. And I thought, wow, that's amazing, The Heart of Light. And from there, I went to Heart of Darkness. And then from there, I went to an abolitionist poet called William Cowper, who wrote a poem that every Christian knows. Every Christian person in the world knows this poem, but they don't know that they know it. It's got this famous line, God moves in mysterious ways, right? And the poem is called Light Shining Out of Darkness. So out of darkness, shining light. So once I had the title, I could infuse this idea, this contrast between light and shadow, between darkness and light throughout the whole book. So it's really how the meat gets into the sausage, Tony. These are some writer's secrets.
Okay, please, can you read for us again? But before you do, the thing about Halima is very perceptive,
yes,
very intuitive, right? So, and she tells us that Chirango is not to be trusted.
It's no good, man. Yeah.
So, we'll come back and you tell me about Chirango, but give us something to listen to, please.
All right. So I'm just going to read from the prologue.
Okay.
So that you see what I meant when I talked about the light and darkness. Yes. Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs, right? Okay. I'm going to read the first paragraph, and then I'm going to read something on page 7. So just 2 very short paragraphs. This is how we carried out of Africa the poor broken body of Wana Daudi, the doctor, David Livingstone, so that he could be borne across the sea and buried in his own land. For more than 1,500 miles, from the interior to the eastern coast, we marched with his body, from Chitambo to Mwanamuzungu, from Chisalamala to Kumbakumba, from Lambalamfipa to Tabora, until 285 days after we left Chitambo, we reached Bagamoyo, that place of sorrow, whose very name means to lay to rest the burden of your heart. On the long and perilous journey to bring him home, 10 of our party lost their lives. There are no stones to mark the places where they rest, no epitaphs to announce their deaths. And when we who remain follow where they led, no pilgrims will come to show their children where we lie. But out of that great and troubling darkness came shining light. Our sacrifice burnished the glory of his life.
Thank you. So in many ways, your book is the epitaph for the unsung, basically.
Yes, that's lovely. Thank you.
When I started reading the book, I checked online, and I only saw mentions of Susie and Chuma.
Yeah, they are the ones who are known about. Yeah.
Yes. Was there a Wainwright, Jacob Wainwright, or did you make it up?
There was a Jacob Wainwright, and he did write a journal. So that part is true. And what's really amazing is that the journal has now been discovered. And I was just waiting. Yeah, I know. Isn't it amazing? So I've been having a wonderful partnership with the David Livingstone birthplace, which is the David Livingstone Museum, because I have visited them 5 years ago to research this book, because I wanted to see where David Livingstone had grown up. Oh my goodness, so poor. He grew up in one room, with his family, with his parents and 10 children, and really desperately poor childhood. So they've turned his childhood home and the mill where he worked into a museum. So I was supposed to do a big event with them in Edinburgh earlier this year, but of course lockdown happened. And I was also supposed to go to the museum to see the discovered journal and write about it. So I'm still hoping that when they open, hopefully early next year, I'll be able to go. But I was very excited, but also quite terrified, because I could make up a journal, right? Yes. Because I knew historically it happened, but no one had, it hadn't been found, right? So it was really an incredible opportunity to actually realize that, wow, this thing has actually been found. And I would love to compare it with what I wrote, because of course mine is pure fiction. There was no love triangle. There probably was no evil Chirango, but it would be really interesting to see his take on the journey, to see how different it is from the one that Chuma and Susie gave when they eventually were brought to London.
So something that I found interesting, and very impressive, was the language. The way you managed, to capture that affectatious, black man trying to sound white, trying to out-white the white, basically. His whole religious. I thought that was devastatingly impressive and subversive, because he just. You just showed Jacob Wainwright up, and I see people like him all the time. In Nigeria here, we call them colonial mentality. They want to be. They have this colonial mentality that they are whiter than. So he was wearing his jacket, his waistcoat, even in the heat. He says that dignity is better than comfort. He just has all this crazy thing he does. So. Are you saying there's nobody you base this character on, because he's too well drawn to be fictional? It's like a composite of people you've met. And
no. He's an archetype. Jacob Wainwright is an archetype. He's a type. He's a type of person. But I wanted to make him more than a type. And basically, so I read, because I love Victorian fiction. I've read everything written by Charles Dickens apart from The Mystery of Edwin Drood, right? Because it's this unfinished novel. And I'm terrified that if I read it, it will end and then the man went to the And then, it stops there. So I haven't read The Mystery of Edwin Drood, but I've read everything that Dickens wrote. I love Victorian sensation fiction. I love Wilkie Collins. I love, all those guys, The Woman in White. The Moonstone is probably one of my favorite Touchstone novels. So I have in my mind, and of course, when I was a child, we used to listen to audio recordings of King Solomon's Mines and so on. So in my mind, I'm a Victorian writer. I'm a proper, full-blown Victorian writer. And this is my Victorian novel. And Jacob Wainwright is my Victorian archetype, is my Victorian character. So, this passage, for instance, and once you understand that he's a Victorian character, you'll understand where he's coming from. I'll just read this paragraph from the second chapter of his journal. So he starts with this little, like what Victorian writers used to do, this little summary of what's going to happen in the chapter. So, second entry from the Journal of Jacob Wainwright, written in Chitambo's village, in which Wainwright gives a thanksgiving for the beautiful gifts of Providence, as he reflects on how he came from the dark into the radical light of God's grace. Right. So already you get an idea of how pompous he is, how important he thinks he is. And then he says, when this journal is published, which is my eventual hope, readers of this account will no doubt already be aware of the Nassik School of the Church Missionary Society, which I have mentioned more than once. It is the only school of its kind, being a school established to educate boys who were captured as slaves and freed by British gunboats. Certainly, the fame of this school has grown beyond the borders of the Principality of Bombay in India, where it is located in Saharanpur, the city of refuge. For the edification of those who may not yet be aware of it, however, it may perhaps be well if I explain that it was established by the Reverend William Price. Who cares, Jacob Wainwright? Who really cares? Nobody. You care. But that's the kind of character he is. He thinks that every single concern of his life is a global concern. He is so self-absorbed. So I really wanted to write this guy who really thought that life began and ended at the Nassik School, because guess what? That's what it was like for him. So when he goes to England, right, and he manages to finagle, that's a great word, to finagle his way to England, right, ahead of the more established companions like Shuma and Susi, because he can speak English, and he says, oh, look, white people, I've been writing about our journey. This is my journal, right? So he manages to finagle his way to England. And he thinks that they're going to make him because he wants the church. He thinks they're going to give him a mission. They're going to establish a church. He's going to build a flock. But he forgets that he's black. He's black in 1874.
Yeah.
He is there to be saved. He's not there to save others.
There's a point where one of the teachers says to him, there's a small issue of you being black.
Well, there's a small issue, Jacob, isn't there, of you being black?
Yeah, he
just get over that small issue.
You still didn't get it, you didn't get it. So where did you find Chirango? We just finished a book that two of my friends and I wrote about the Yoruba gods, and I was fascinated by Eshu, who is the god of mischief, the god of the crossroads, and I think that in so many ways Chirango approximates to Eshu. He's the one who whispers in your ears, and then steals your sleep, basically, until you act on what he has put in your ears. Where did you find him, and how much fun did you have writing him? Because he's such, in one instance he's talking about himself in the third person, the next he's groveling and begging, the next he's plotting to take over his kingdom. Where did you find him?
Okay, so again, to set it up for readers, Chirango is sort of the antagonist of the. See how I'm talking all these theatrical terms. He's the antagonist of the novel, right? And so he's a very interesting man, because only Halima sees through him, because she's like, dude, I've seen your type. I know your type. I've seen you before, right? Whereas Jacob, because he's one of the first people to convert to Christianity under Jacob's tutelage, Jacob takes him at face value, right? And where Chirango came from, Tony, you will not believe it. Chirango is basically my fictional Robert Mugabe. Chirango is Robert Mugabe. He's somebody who is absolutely right in principle, but he is absolutely wrong in execution. You know, I wrote this. I wrote this biography of Robert Mugabe, and I was hammered in Nigeria. I was hammered. You know, you guys with your Pan-Africanism, which you get with your mother's milk. Ooh, I mean, I was like, people were like, "You ungrateful child. Mugabe gave you land. What is wrong with you? Why aren't you grateful? How can you say this about a great man of Africa?" You know. So I just wanted to write a character who does that to people, where people say, yes, Chirango is right. The white men mean no good, but it is methods that are problematic. And again, I can't go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil it for readers. But there's a powerful speech that it really took a lot out of me to write, where Chirango basically attacks Jacob Wainwright and says, do you not see what these white men are doing? Do you not see that they come here saying they're looking for the beginning of a river today, they want to trade with you tomorrow, but actually what they're after is to take over the land? This happened in my own kingdom. And this kingdom, of course, is the Mutapa Empire, which was in the end overrun by the Portuguese long before colonialism. So I wanted to bring in that element to show that there were other places, kingdoms, entities, nations, before the power of Bismarck's ruler divided up Africa. So that's what Chirango does. Chirango stands in for that kind of nationalist leader who absolutely gets imperialism and who opposes it, but in the process is somebody who then creates problems for his own people. So that's what Chirango represents.
So cool. There are so many ironies in the book, right? And you know, sometimes I feel like, okay, so is it because the character doesn't fully understand, or is this Petina, you know, putting forward an agenda or an idea? One of them is when Halima says, why would a man leave his land, sail for months just to find the beginning of a river, right? And then at the end, you travel 1,000 kilometers to take the same man, you know, back to his place. So for me, there's an irony there that you think it's a fruitless venture coming all this far to seek the source of a river, but then when he dies, you recognize that this person is actually important enough to be sent back to where he's come from. I mean, forget about the issue of his soul wandering and stuff. So, yeah. And those ironies come up. And then the irony of David Livingstone also accepting patronage, you know, from slavers, you know. But for me, I will read it as him being pragmatic. I mean, he's here. If he refused, then he could endanger himself and the people he has saved. So, but I mean, I think so. The intricacies and the nuances of this whole the way people behave when they are in certain situations, you know, can you speak to that? You know, how much does Halima understand of this, and why would you spend 9 months, you know, ferrying the corpse of a man who you think was on a fruitless journey?
Okay, that's really great, Tony. So first of all, I mean, the judgment that Halima makes of Livingstone, why would a man leave his home, sail across the sea to look for the beginning of a river? That's not my agenda. That is me imagining what people must have thought of David Livingstone. Imagine this strange white man with weird hair rocks up in your village or your town, and he says, I'm actually looking for the source of the Nile. And you're like, huh? I mean, first of all, you've come the wrong way. You're going south instead of going east, right? But second of all, why? I mean, why would you be doing this? It just seems like the most bizarre thing. If there's a practical effect to it, yeah, then tell us. But we don't understand why you would do all of this. So I was actually just basically putting myself in the shoes of the people to whom David Livingstone must have appeared as absolutely nuts, right? And it was important to me to do that because one of the people who really influenced me as I was writing this was Hilary Mantel, who's a wonderful author of historical fiction. And I listened, I actually have them in my head, the Reith lectures that she gave on writing historical fiction. And one of the things she says is, don't give your own agenda to your characters, because your characters exist in a particular in a particular time, right? So it's like when you're watching a Jane Austen film and the women are running, and it's very irritating because women didn't run in Jane Austen's time. They're like running towards them. And I'm like, no, why is she running? But for me, it was really important to always have that in mind. So, for instance, Halima, as I said earlier, invites a feminist reading, but Halima is not a feminist. There's no way a slave woman in 1873 could have been a feminist. There's just no way. But she can invite a feminist reading. She's independent, she's fierce, she's all those things, but she doesn't understand the theory of feminism, right? In the same way that Jacob Wainwright, in the end, he does sort of decolonize himself without realizing that this is what he's doing. But it would have been very artificial to have a passage in which Jacob Wainwright says, yes, I am now going to decolonize my mind like Ngugi. This is before colonialism, so it doesn't even arise, the whole decolonization conversation, but he invites a decolonized reading. Do you see? So yeah, so that's really, for me, something that was important to emphasize, that these are people of their time. So they are judging Livingstone with the standards of their time. Now, as to why they then did a similarly fruitless exercise in carrying the body, I give at least 4 or 5 reasons, right? Thomas Pakenham, who wrote The Scramble for Africa, locates this journey that they make as the most important journey in African exploration, because that's the journey that led to colonization, right? And I asked him, why do you think they did it? And he said, why do you think they did it? So I gave him 4 reasons, and he said, I think it was love. I mean, he's, a lovely old, romantic man, and he thought that, they'd done this out of love. And I thought, yes, I think for some of them, especially for a boy like Majwara, who was rescued by Livingstone from slavery, it would have been love, right? But for someone like Chirango, who's more calculating, he probably thought, oh, we're going to get a reward, right? Or I'm going to find a way to punish people on the journey, right? For someone like Halima or Mochosi or Misozi or Taweka, who are more superstitious, they're like, get these bones off our country, out of our territory. You should just go home, right? And then for them, there was also the empathy thing, right? Why would you bury a man away from his children? His children are never going to see their mother's grave. She's somewhere in Mozambique, right? And now he's the father, buried in a forest, no one to see him. So there's that empathy thing as well going on. So yeah, so there were multiple reasons why they chose to do it. But for me, the really interesting question is, why did they choose to go on, even in the light of all their difficulties? They could simply have said, you know what, dude, Livingstone, Diva, we're burying you here, right? This is where you rest, and then we go on, because this has been hard enough. But what it is, I think they were sort of like propelled by some kind of sunk cost fallacy. When you're in a relationship that's just going nowhere, right? And you're thinking, you know what, I should end this today, but damn, I've given 10 years of my life to this man. It has to work. It has to work, So that's sort of like sunk cost, where you want to recover those 10 years, forgetting that you're actually going to lose 10 more years in front. Do you know what I mean? So I think there was that going on as well, which is that they were sort of like propelled by their own momentum, as it were.
I can see where you have different reasons. I mean, Chirango, for instance, was clearly hoping that there will be some kind of, pecuniary reward at the end for him or whoever makes it. Yeah, I understand that. And then, so Africans don't do historical fiction that much, when we say historical fiction in Africa, we're talking about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but you are, going back past 100 years or more. And there's been a rush of historical novels coming up now to 100 wells of
Saramago.
yeah, and then the rest of. So, do you think this is a trend, a new current, and why is it that it's mostly women who are going on these excursions to the past?
Look, I have to tell you this. I mean, I actually wanted to start a Twitter thread the other day about stories from the African past that would make good novels. And then I thought, nah, somebody will steal all my ideas, right? But no, but the more I read, there are thousands. I mean, literally thousands of stories set in the past. I mean, Jaja of Opobo. I mean, just Jaja of Opobo. He's a novel on his own. Freeing himself from a sack after he had been kidnapped. The two brothers in my novel, Tipu Tip and Kumba Kumba, the biggest slave traders in East Africa, who themselves, by the way, were the children of a slave, right? Yes. That's like a whole novel on its own, right? I'm absolutely fascinated by Mary Kingsley. She came to your part of the world. She was one of the few female explorers. And of course, her relationship to Charles Kingsley, the author of The Water Babies and so on. There are thousands. I mean, Richard Burton, oh my gosh. There's a wonderful novel about Bombay, who's one of the characters I write about here, called The Collector of Worlds. And it's basically, it's a novel about Richard Burton as told by the people around him, including Bombay, who, by the way, is the most extraordinary man in African fiction. I just have to tell you a little bit about him. His full name was Sidi Mubarak. His nickname was Bombay because he had been at this Nasic school in India. He crossed Africa 4 times, east, west, west, east, east, west, west, east. He traveled with everyone, with Burton, with Speke, with Livingstone, with Stanley. I mean, he was an extraordinary man. So his life alone could be like 3 volumes, right? And there's so many stories. I'm currently obsessed with, I'm writing a big novel that takes in 400 years of the Mtapa Empire, right? From its establishment as an offshoot of the Great Zimbabwe Empire to 1910, when the last Mutapa is defeated, so there's so many things, there's so many historical novels that we can write. But what it is, Toni, is it takes a particular kind of mind. You have to be obsessive. You have to be obsessive about research, especially if you want to do it well. You have to be really obsessive about research. And for me, it took forever to write David Livingstone, to write this. The Mutapa will be a little bit easier because there are not that many historical documents. They're mainly in Portuguese, so I'll probably have to learn Portuguese, But the point really is that if you want to do historical fiction well, you have to have that forensic mind, and it takes a lot of time. So I'm sure that for a lot of writers who have many books to write, it's probably just easier to write something contemporary because it doesn't take as much digging into the archives as historical fiction does. I mean, but like you, I'm very encouraged and very delighted to see so many people turning their attention to historical fiction.
And they're mostly women.
Yeah, because women are thorough. No, I'm a big fan of women. I'm a big fan of women. I think, if you gave women the world, I will sort it out for you. Nice. Okay. In like 6 months, you'll have everything right.
The jury is out on that. There was something I found interesting. I mean, I had gone maybe halfway to the book when I realized that Swahili was actually Swahili. From the spelling. The way you are spelling Swahili.
And not Kiswahili, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I was like, what is this? This actually, it's just. I'm sure that the way we the way we spell it now is the anglicized version, right? And that will speak to the older version of the language.
There are 2 spellings of Swahili in the book, just like there are 2 spellings of Bagamoyo. So when Jacob Wainwright talks about Swahili, he writes it S-U-A-H-E-L-I. Swahili. That's how they wrote it in those days. Just like Bagamoyo was written with an M-O-I-O at the end and not Bagamoyo, right? So again, is to say, this is a book that's set in 1873. I am not going to change attitudes. I'm not going to change spellings. So that's why the slave trade, for instance, it's a constant hum in the background, because one of the things they have to do as they make their way to the coast is to avoid the port of Kilwa, which was a major trading port. But if they had gone in a straight line from Chitambo to Kilwa, they would have made that journey in a much shorter time. But they had to avoid it. So they had to go sort of like round and so on and so on. And so the slave trade is there, but I don't have a chapter saying slavery is wrong, don't keep slaves, because that wasn't the attitude of the time. So then, of course, you have the freed slaves like Jacob Wainwright, Chuma, Amoda, and others who are opposed to the slave trade because of their personal experience with it, right? And because they feel that it's wrong, or it's ungodly, or it's unchristian, or whatever, just like David Livingstone believed that it was a scar on the conscience of the world. But I don't have William Wilberforce types writing pamphlets saying, end slavery, abolish slavery today, because that wouldn't have been at all realistic in the context in which that they were traveling.
I have two more questions for you, right?
Great.
One is the massacre of the women, right? It came out of nowhere. It was almost without reason, right? I sense it's historically valid, but I'm wondering, why did you put it in the book? Because why? I mean, I think it marks David Livingstone's descent, health-wise. But why did you put it in the book?
Precisely because it is the single most important episode of David Livingstone's career as a missionary, as an explorer, because it's the event that led to the event that we then see in the last part of the book, which is the closure of the Zanzibar slave market. It's David Livingstone's single biggest success. He was a spectacularly poor missionary, by the way. He only converted one person, who then changed his mind when he realized he had to send away his ex-wives, right? So he was a very poor missionary. He managed to translate the Bible into Tswana, which was a very successful thing to do. But he was a traveler more than he was a missionary. He enjoyed people. He enjoyed listening to people's stories and writing them down. He wasn't really a fervent missionary. But the Nyangwe massacre, the massacre at Nyangwe, is really important because his eyewitness account of that massacre created so much outrage in Victorian England that it allowed the government to put pressure on the Sultan of Zanzibar to close the market. So if this were ever to be a film or a series, it would begin with Nyangwe and end with the closure of the market, because that's the arc, right? And because I do a lot of flashback, it might not be very clear, but that's really the sort of like the arc that allows Halima, for instance, to become a truly free woman, right? Because the slave market is closed. So the peril of slavery is gone from her life, right? And to me, it was also, as you say so nicely, it was also a way to show the beginning of the end for Livingstone, because that's the thing that broke his spirit, right? Seeing those women, and also, by the way, blaming himself because he had had a quarrel with this Dugumbe guy who ended up killing all these women. So he wondered whether it had something to do with his own quarrel with this man. And there were all these rumors that some of the men might have been involved in shooting, so he carried, I think, to his death, a burden of guilt about what happened with Nyangwe. But he wrote so beautifully, so powerfully, the eyewitness account of what he saw, that it led to, as I said before, in the end, the closure of the Zanzibar market.
So my last question. Do you think David Livingstone was a madman, or he had something going?
I am going to answer this question by reading from his own journal, right? And this is a passage that I found in an essay by Chinua Achebe. And so I found it about 12 years ago. And I'm so glad I found it, and I tracked it to its source. And this is the passage that made me believe that writing about David Livingstone's companions was worth it, not only because of the companions, but because of David Livingstone himself. And it's an essay in which Chinua Achebe takes on Conrad. So we're back to Conrad, Heart of Darkness. And he contrasts Conrad with David Livingstone. And he says, David Livingstone, born in an earlier time, proved to be a much more human person. And he proved to be a man who was more advanced than his age. And this is the passage that Chinua Achebe quotes. I have found it difficult to come to a conclusion on the character of the African. They sometimes perform actions remarkably good, and sometimes as strangely the opposite. I have been unable to ascertain the motive of the good or to account for the callousness of conscience with which they perpetrate the bad. After long observation, I came to the conclusion that they are just a strange mixture of good and evil, as men are everywhere else. I mean, that's an extraordinary passage for somebody who was writing in 1866, right? Where this idea of the savage, either he was a noble savage or he was just a savage. And Livingstone is saying, hey, my experience of Africans is that they're just like men everywhere else. It seems very banal to us talking now, but this is 1860 something. And this is David Livingstone saying, my experience of Africans is that they're just as normal as everyone else. And there's even a passage where he criticizes, I think it's Burton, who talks about how mothers were selling their children and, cannibalism. And David Livingstone's like, you know what, I haven't experienced that. If a mother sold a child, it would probably be because she was in some great need or other. But my experience, and then he talks in another passage about hearing the cry of babies and how they remind him of his own children that are far away. So he was a madman, yes. He was stubborn as hell. He was a terrible explorer, right? Terrible explorer. He sailed up the wrong way on the Zambezi, that kind of thing. But he was, I think at the heart of it, he was a good man. He was a good man. And because he was a good man, it made it rewarding to write about him and to write about his companions carrying his body.
Thank you, Petina Gappah, for this wonderful book and for this chat. I enjoyed reading this book. I enjoyed it. The characters are just amazing. The historical value you create is something out of this world. And I'm happy I was asked to read this and have this chat with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you so much. That was lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I hope when you find Jacob's journals, they will be aligned to what you've done.
Actually, I hope not. I really hope not, because man, they would have suffered.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony.
Sticky, spicy, sweet. I want to go then. Don't touch me. I will get you arrested. Very, very easy. Relax, everybody. He shot you.
madness only you can understand. Visit myspectre.com to get your Spectre experience. Spectre, loans in 5 minutes.
If you ever need a new place to go, you can join me in a world of words. Many seems like I'm nowhere to be found. If you look, you'll find me in a book. Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon. You'll never be alone. Now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the world in a book. You'll never be alone. Now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the world in a book.
We don't just think of ourselves as a bank. We think of ourselves as corporate citizens with responsibility for growing the economy. Reading and education is a key part of it. But equally important is having access to reading materials at home. A lot of the intervention we've done throughout this COVID is to ensure that people can safely navigate the uncertainties of the COVID crisis and come out of it ready for, to live again.
Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon.
The dreams that we have are limited by what we have directly interacted with. What reading does is it makes it possible for you to begin to live in worlds that don't yet exist. One read creates a discipline of reading. One read puts me on a timeline. It gives me an important book and I have an opportunity to read it and to collaborate. It's almost like having someone who does your book selection for you. If you have editors and people who are really good at this saying to you, this is the book for the month, I value that. I want to be able to read in a community. I want reading to be a collaborative thing. I want reading to be a communing, and One Read allows me to do that. I will use One Read any day, anytime.
Stranger's Guide is not a typical American travel magazine. Our mission is to dive deep into a single location, commissioning work from great writers and photographers, famous individuals, as well as up-and-coming new voices. This year, we decided to go to Lagos. And we are proud of the volume we produced, with original work from some of Nigeria's best writers and photographers, working with luminaries like Wale Soyinka, Molara Wood, and Femi Kuti. We think this is a very special volume, and we're so excited to bring it back to Lagos.